The moment you stop shrinking your mind to make others comfortable is the exact moment they start calling you arrogant. And here's the part nobody explains to you early enough. Intelligence has never been socially neutral. It changes how people react to you before you even finish your sentence. There's a quiet fact psychologists have observed for decades. People don't usually react negatively to intelligence itself. They react to the feeling comparison creates inside them. When someone suddenly realizes you're seeing patterns faster, questioning assumptions deeper, or refusing to follow conversations just because everyone else agrees, their brain does something protective. It doesn't say, "Let me grow." It says, "Who do you think you are?" And just like that, your clarity becomes attitude. What's strange is this. The same behavior that gets labeled confidence in one person gets labeled arrogance in another. Not because the behavior changed, but because the audience changed. Intelligence doesn't threaten secure people. It only unsettles environments that secretly depend on everyone thinking the same way. That's why some of the smartest people you know learned very early how to edit themselves. They learned when to pretend they didn't notice contradictions, when to nod at ideas that made no sense, when to laugh at jokes that were logically impossible but socially required, not because they lacked courage, but because they wanted peace. And honestly, if intelligence came with a warning label, it would probably say, "Side effects may include being misunderstood by people who stopped asking questions in 2007. Because the truth is, the word arrogant gets used in a very specific moment. The moment someone realizes they can't control how you think. It shows up when you stop agreeing just to belong. It shows up when you explain something too clearly for manipulation to survive. It shows up when your presence quietly exposes how much pretending is happening around you. And suddenly, without changing your tone, without raising your voice, without trying to dominate anyone, you become the problem. Not because you made anyone feel small, but because your mind stopped asking permission to exist at its full size. Number one, they call it arrogance, because they cannot explain why you see what they don't. There is a very uncomfortable moment that happens inside people when they realize you are noticing something they completely missed. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it shows up as irritation. Sometimes it comes out as jokes about your attitude. But what's really happening is simple. Your awareness exposed a gap they didn't know existed. Most people move through life using borrowed conclusions. They trust what the group believes. They repeat what sounds reasonable. They follow what has always been done. So when someone like you starts pointing out patterns, contradictions, or deeper meanings that weren't obvious to everyone else, it interrupts the comfort of that system. Not because you attacked anyone, but because you saw something early. And people don't like feeling late. The strange part is they rarely say, "How did you notice that?" Instead they say, "Why do you always think differently?" That sentence sounds harmless, but it carries a hidden accusation. It suggests that thinking independently is a personality problem instead of a strength. What they're really reacting to is unfamiliar clarity. When your mind connects dots faster than expected, it creates pressure in conversations. Suddenly, others feel like they have to defend opinions they never examined before. They feel like they're being evaluated, even when you're just speaking normally. And instead of admitting that the moment made them uncomfortable, they protect themselves by changing the story. Now it's no longer about what you noticed. It becomes about your tone, your confidence, or your ego. So the label arrogant appears. But arrogance usually tries to dominate people. What you're doing is simply recognizing patterns earlier than most. That difference matters. The truth is, intelligence doesn't make people angry. It makes uncertainty visible. And uncertainty is something many people were never taught how to handle. So instead of growing through the moment, they reduce the moment by reducing you. That's why the word arrogant often shows up exactly when your understanding becomes impossible for them to ignore. It's not a description of your character. It's their explanation for a gap they don't yet have the language to close. Number 2, intelligence exposes hierarchy illusions people secretly depend on. Most people don't realize how many invisible ranking systems exist inside everyday life. There are unspoken rules about who is expected to lead conversations, who is allowed to disagree, who gets listened to first, and who is supposed to stay quiet and learn their place. These systems are rarely announced out loud, but everyone feels them. They shape how people behave without anyone admitting they are following them. When you think independently and speak with clarity, you quietly interrupt those invisible structures, not because you're trying to challenge anyone, but because your mind doesn't automatically accept roles that were never logically assigned in the first place. You respond based on what makes sense, not based on who is supposed to be above you socially. And that alone changes the energy in a room. Some people depend on those silent rankings to feel secure. They're comfortable when they already know who is supposed to be smarter, louder, or more important in the conversation. It gives them direction. It gives them identity. It tells them where they stand. But when someone like you speaks with insight without waiting for permission, those positions suddenly feel unstable. It creates confusion they can't easily explain. Instead of asking themselves why your perspective carries weight, they assume you're stepping outside your position. And when someone believes you crossed a line that only existed in their mind, they don't say, maybe the line was never real. They say, you're acting arrogant. What makes this situation even more interesting is that you usually don't notice the hierarchy at all. You're not trying to climb it. You're not trying to break it. You're simply not participating in it. And that's exactly what makes people uncomfortable. Because when one person stops following invisible rules, others start realizing those rules were never as solid as they thought. That realization can feel threatening to someone who built their confidence on being above others in quiet ways they never talked about openly. So when your intelligence ignores those silent rankings, it doesn't just change conversations, it changes the balance people were relying on to feel secure. And instead of admitting that balance was fragile, they call your independence arrogance because it's easier than admitting the hierarchy only existed in the first place, because everyone agreed to pretend it did. Number 3, people mistake calm certainty for superiority when they rely on loudness to feel important. There is a subtle misunderstanding that happens between different kinds of intelligence. Some people associate strength with volume, emotion, or constant expression. They believe the more someone talks, reacts, or fills space, the more engaged or confident they are. In that kind of environment, silence or calm speech gets misread very easily. When you carry calm certainty, you don't rush to prove what you already understand. You don't compete for attention in conversations. You don't inflate your words just to be heard. You simply speak when something is clear, and you leave space where unnecessary noise would normally exist. But in spaces where people rely on verbal energy to feel validated, that kind of presence feels unfamiliar. So instead of seeing it as stability, they interpret it as distance. They start to feel like you are placing yourself above the conversation, even when you are fully present in it. The issue is not what you are saying, but how little effort it takes for you to say it. For people who equate importance with effort, effortless clarity can look like arrogance. If they have to struggle to organize their thoughts and you don't, they assume the difference must be intentional superiority rather than natural processing. There is also something deeper going on. Loudness often hides uncertainty. When someone is unsure, they may fill space with extra words to maintain control of how they are perceived. So when they meet someone who does not need that strategy, it creates internal discomfort. Your calmness unintentionally highlights their dependence on performance. Instead of recognizing that difference, they reinterpret it in a way that protects their self-image. They convince themselves that you are simply acting above them, because that explanation feels safer than admitting they rely on noise to feel secure in communication. What makes this even more layered is that calm certainty does not invite easy interruption. You don't over-explain yourself so others cannot easily steer your meaning. That lack of access can feel like exclusion to people used to controlling conversations through volume or repetition. So the label arrogant becomes a shortcut explanation for something they can't comfortably adjust to. It's not about superiority, it's about contrast. And when contrast feels too sharp, people soften it in their minds by turning it into judgment instead of understanding. Number 4. Your refusal to perform confusion makes others uncomfortable with their own confusion. Most people don't openly realize how much of social life is built on pretending to understand things slightly better than they actually do. It's not always dishonest in a malicious way. It's more like a quiet agreement between people to avoid exposing gaps in knowledge too sharply. In many conversations, people nod, agree, or give general responses not because everything is clear, but because it keeps things smooth. When you don't participate in that performance, the dynamic changes immediately. If something doesn't make sense to you, you don't rush to fake understanding. You pause. You question it. You ask for clarity in a way that is direct, not softened by social cushioning. That behavior seems simple, but it disrupts a very old habit many people rely on to avoid embarrassment. Because now, instead of everyone quietly pretending, your presence makes the uncertainty visible. And that visibility creates pressure. People start to notice that they might not fully understand what they just agreed to. They become aware that their confidence was partially built on assumption. That realization is uncomfortable, especially in environments where being quick to understand is quietly tied to being respected. So instead of confronting that discomfort, the mind takes a shortcut. It reframes the situation. It becomes easier to believe that you are being difficult, overly analytical, or acting superior than to admit, I might not actually understand this as well as I thought. This is where the misunderstanding forms. Your honesty about confusion exposes the difference between real understanding and performed understanding. But instead of being seen as clarity-seeking, it gets interpreted as disruption, because you are not following the unspoken rule of pretending to be on the same page at all times. People feel exposed in your presence without you directly exposing them. That's the part that gets misread as arrogance. Not because you acted above anyone, but because you refused to lower your awareness to match a shared illusion. And when people feel that illusion break, they rarely thank the person who broke it. They protect themselves by assigning a label. It keeps their internal balance intact. So your refusal to perform confusion becomes, in their mind, a flaw in your character instead of what it really is. A refusal to trade truth for comfort. Number 5. Intelligence removes your need for approval, and that scares people who survive on approval economies. Approval is not just a social habit for many people. It is a system they depend on to feel stable in themselves. Compliments, agreement, validation, and emotional reassurance become quiet forms of currency that keep interactions smooth. In that kind of environment, people learn to measure their value by how others respond to them. If others react positively, they feel right. If others stay neutral or distant, they start to doubt themselves. So when someone operates without that dependency, it creates an unspoken imbalance. You speak without constantly checking how it will be received. You make decisions without adjusting your thoughts to gain immediate acceptance. You don't reshape your ideas just to keep approval flowing in your direction. And even though you are not doing anything aggressive or dismissive, that independence becomes noticeable. To people who rely on approval, this can feel confusing at first. They expect a certain level of emotional participation in every interaction, a kind of mutual reassurance exchange. But when you don't engage in that pattern, they are left without the usual signals they depend on to measure connection. That absence creates discomfort they can't easily name. Instead of recognizing your independence as internal security, they interpret it as emotional distance. And emotional distance, in their framework, often gets labeled as pride or arrogance. Because if someone is not actively seeking validation, the mind assumes they must believe they don't need anyone at all. What they miss is that you are not rejecting people. You are simply not outsourcing your self-worth. Your sense of direction does not shift every time someone reacts differently to you. That creates stability, but it also removes predictability for those who are used to shaping themselves based on feedback. The deeper tension is that approval-based systems depend on participation. When you stop participating, even quietly, it weakens the unspoken structure others rely on to feel secure in their social identity. They can no longer easily place you in the usual categories of likes me, agrees with me, or validates me. So the mind fills the gap with a simpler explanation. It becomes easier to say you are arrogant than to admit you are operating from a different internal foundation altogether. Because acknowledging that would force them to question how much of their own confidence is built on external reaction instead of internal certainty. Number 6, you don't make them feel small. Your presence makes comparison unavoidable. Most people don't consciously walk into situations expecting to compare themselves with others, but comparison still happens automatically in the background. The mind constantly measures speed, clarity, confidence, and understanding as a way to locate itself socially. It's a quiet process, but it shapes how people feel in conversations more than they realize. When you enter a space with strong mental clarity, that automatic comparison becomes sharper. Not because you're trying to compete, but because your way of thinking is noticeable. You process ideas quickly, or you connect thoughts in a way that feels direct and structured. That difference becomes a reference point for others, even if no one says it out loud. At that moment, some people start to feel a shift inside themselves. It's not always about being less intelligent. It can simply be the awareness that someone else reached a conclusion faster, deeper, or with fewer steps. And that awareness can create discomfort if someone is used to feeling aligned or equal in conversations. Instead of sitting with that feeling and processing it internally, many people look for a way to explain it externally, because it is easier to adjust the story about you than to sit with a sudden awareness about themselves. So what begins as internal comparison slowly turns into external judgment. Your presence didn't create the comparison deliberately. It just removed the illusion that everyone operates at the same pace or depth in every situation. And when that illusion breaks, people sometimes feel exposed without anything actually being said against them. That's where misinterpretation starts. Your clarity is not an attack, but it highlights differences that were previously unnoticed or unacknowledged. And when differences become visible, some people experience it as hierarchy, even when none was intended. So instead of saying, "I noticed something about myself in that moment," the easier narrative becomes, "You made me feel small." It transfers responsibility away from internal reflection and places it onto your presence. But what actually happened is simpler. You didn't reduce anyone's value. You just made the comparison process unavoidable. And in environments where self-worth is fragile or externally measured, Even neutral awareness can feel like pressure. So the label arrogant becomes a way to soften a moment that was never about dominance, only about awareness becoming too clear to ignore. Number 7. Precision sounds aggressive to people trained to communicate vaguely. Communication styles are not equal across all environments. Some people are raised or conditioned in spaces where meaning is often indirect, softened, or spread across many words. In those settings, conversations are not built around accuracy, but around emotional tone, social harmony, and implied understanding. So people learn to read between lines rather than deal with direct statements. When someone speaks with precision, it changes that entire rhythm. You don't add unnecessary decoration to your thoughts. You don't stretch ideas just to make them feel softer or more acceptable. You say what you mean in a way that is structured and direct. To you, it feels like efficiency. To others, used to vague communication, it can feel unusually sharp, even if nothing offensive is being said. The problem is not the truth itself, but how clearly it is delivered. Vague communication allows people to adjust meaning to their comfort level. It gives them space to interpret things in a way that protects their emotions or existing beliefs. But precision removes that flexibility. It narrows interpretation down. It makes ideas harder to reshape or soften internally. And when people lose that flexibility, they may feel exposed or corrected, even if you are not correcting them at all. So instead of engaging with the actual content of what you are saying, some people react to how it makes them feel in the moment. If the message is too direct, they may associate that directness with aggression, not because it contains hostility, but because it does not cushion them from discomfort. There is also another layer to this. Precision often exposes weak reasoning. When ideas are vague, they are harder to challenge. But when they are clear and structured, any inconsistency becomes easier to notice. For people who rely on loosely formed thoughts, that level of clarity can feel like pressure, not because you are attacking them, but because the structure of your thinking removes room for ambiguity. So instead of recognizing precision as clarity, they interpret it as intensity, and intensity in their framework often gets mistaken for arrogance. What they miss is that you are not raising your voice in meaning, you are simply removing excess noise. But in environments where noise is familiar, silence between the lines feels uncomfortable. And when discomfort has no obvious source, people often assign it to the person speaking clearly rather than to the habit of being used to vagueness. Number 8, intelligence quietly refuses manipulation, and manipulators interpret resistance as ego. Manipulation does not always look obvious. In many everyday situations, it appears as pressure wrapped in politeness, emotional expectation disguised as care, or subtle attempts to guide someone's thinking without directly stating it. It often works best on people who are willing to adjust their position quickly just to keep peace or maintain approval. But when intelligence is grounded and self-aware, it naturally starts to recognize these patterns without effort. You begin to notice when a conversation is not just about information, but about influence. You notice when someone is trying to shape your reaction instead of genuinely exchanging ideas. And instead of reacting emotionally or being pulled into that direction, you simply pause, question, or step outside the frame being offered. That response alone changes everything. For someone relying on influence, your resistance feels unexpected. They are used to subtle pressure working, even if only slightly. So when it doesn't work on you, it creates friction. Not loud friction, but internal frustration. Because the usual tools they depend on are no longer effective in your presence. And instead of reflecting on why their approach didn't land, they often reinterpret the situation in a way that protects their own intention. It becomes easier to believe that you are difficult, overly proud, or acting superior than to consider that you simply saw through the attempt. This is where the label ego or arrogance gets attached. But what they are calling ego is often just clarity combined with boundaries. You are not necessarily rejecting people. You are just not absorbing direction that was never clearly justified. You are not reacting on impulse to emotional cues designed to guide your response. You are slowing the process down enough to think independently before agreeing or disagreeing. That pause is powerful, and it disrupts expectation. In environments where influence is usually smooth and unchallenged, that disruption feels like resistance to authority, even when no authority was actually present. So instead of adjusting their approach, some people adjust their perception of you, because it is easier to believe you are acting from pride than to accept that their influence is no longer automatic around you. What they miss is that intelligence does not always say no loudly. Sometimes it simply stops moving on command. And in a world where many interactions rely on unconscious compliance, even quiet independence can be misread as arrogance, when in reality it is just awareness refusing to be directed without reason. Number 9, intelligence often refuses to participate in unnecessary drama. And drama-dependent people interpret absence as superiority. Not everyone relates to life through clarity and logic. For some people, emotional intensity, conflict, and constant interpersonal activity are what make interactions feel meaningful. Drama, in subtle or obvious forms, becomes part of how connection is maintained. It can be gossip, tension, emotional reactions, or situations where everything feels slightly unstable, but socially engaging. In those environments, staying involved is often seen as being present or connected. So when someone with a calm, observant, and mentally focused nature steps away from that pattern, it creates confusion. You are not feeding into unnecessary arguments. You are not reacting to every emotional trigger. You are not engaging in conversations that exist only to recycle tension. Instead, you choose silence where there is no value, and distance where things are not worth your energy. But in drama-dependent spaces, that behavior is not interpreted as simplicity or discipline. It is interpreted through comparison. If everyone else is emotionally invested in every small conflict and you are not, the difference becomes noticeable. And instead of seeing it as emotional regulation, some people read it as detachment or superiority. Because in their internal framework, participation equals belonging. So non-participation feels like elevation. There is also a subtle discomfort that comes from not being able to pull someone into the usual emotional cycles. When you do not react strongly, arguments lose fuel. When you do not amplify tension, it fades faster. When you do not take sides unnecessarily, the emotional structure collapses. And for people used to that structure, your calmness feels like disruption. Instead of recognizing that you simply do not find value in unnecessary conflict, they create a different explanation. It becomes easier to believe you think you are above it all than to accept that you are simply not interested in feeding cycles that lead nowhere. What they miss is that your distance is not a performance. It is selection. You are not withdrawing to make a statement. You are simply not engaging where engagement has no purpose. But in environments where emotional noise is mistaken for connection, quiet awareness gets misread, and the less you participate, the more others assume you are positioning yourself above them, when in reality, you are just stepping out of patterns that drain attention without adding meaning. So the label arrogant appears again, not because you elevated yourself, but because you stopped entering spaces where chaos is mistaken for involvement and reaction is mistaken for relationship. Number 10, your ability to see patterns early makes others feel late. There is a quiet difference between people who react to events and people who notice patterns forming before those events fully unfold. Pattern recognition is not always dramatic or visible. It often shows up as simple awareness. You understand where something is heading long before it becomes obvious to everyone else. You are not guessing. You are just connecting what most people are not yet paying attention to. But timing creates discomfort. When you see something early and later it becomes obvious to everyone, a strange shift happens in how people relate to your earlier awareness. At the time you mentioned it, it may have been ignored or dismissed. But when reality eventually confirms it, people are forced to revisit that moment where they didn't see what you saw. And that memory can feel uncomfortable. Instead of saying they were simply late to the realization, many people adjust the narrative in a different direction, because admitting they missed something others noticed earlier can feel like a threat to their self-image. So rather than processing the gap in timing, they reframe the situation in a way that protects their pride. Your early clarity becomes the problem in their memory, not their delayed understanding. This is where misinterpretation starts to grow. What was once just insight turns into something else in hindsight. People may begin to remember your earlier certainty not as awareness, but as attitude. Because if you were right before others could see it, then it creates an uncomfortable comparison between your perception and theirs. And comparison is rarely neutral. It creates a subtle sense of being behind, even if nothing was directly said. That feeling is what gets projected outward. Instead of acknowledging you saw it sooner, the mind often shifts to you acted like you knew everything. But what actually happened is much simpler. You were just earlier in the pattern. You saw the direction things were taking before it fully formed. You noticed signals that others only recognized once they became too obvious to ignore. Still, timing changes perception more than truth does, because being early looks like confidence to those who arrive later. And when people feel late to understanding, they often protect themselves by rewriting your earlier clarity into arrogance, instead of accepting that you were simply paying attention before they were ready to. Number 11. Some people depend on complexity to hide weakness. Your clarity removes their hiding place. Not everyone builds confidence on understanding. Some people build it on how complicated they can make things sound. Complexity becomes a kind of shield. If something feels difficult to explain, it can also feel difficult to challenge. And in many environments, sounding intelligent becomes more important than being precise. So people learn to wrap simple ideas in layers of unnecessary language. They stretch explanations. They add extra steps. They use vague terms that sound deep, but don't actually say anything concrete. Over time, this creates an illusion of knowledge. As long as something sounds complex enough, it can pass as insight. But clarity disrupts that system instantly. When you speak in a way that removes confusion instead of adding to it, the structure some people rely on starts to weaken. You don't match their complexity with more complexity. You simplify the idea until only what is real remains. And when that happens, there is no longer room for performance to hide behind. That can create discomfort in people who are used to relying on layered speech as a form of protection. Because now the gap between real understanding and decorative understanding becomes visible. What used to feel impressive suddenly feels unnecessary, and what used to feel like authority starts to look like overcompensation. Instead of adjusting, the mind often protects itself by changing how it interprets you. It becomes easier to say you are arrogant or dismissive than to accept that clarity just exposed something they were leaning on without realizing it. There is also another layer to this. When someone consistently removes confusion from a topic, it takes away the advantage of ambiguity. People who rely on ambiguity to stay unchallenged lose control over how their ideas are received, because now everything is clear enough to be evaluated directly, and direct evaluation can feel threatening when someone is not fully confident in what they are presenting. So instead of engaging with the simplicity of what you said, they sometimes react to the way it dismantles their complexity. Not because you attacked them, but because you made it impossible for unclear thinking to hide behind impressive language. What they call arrogance is often just exposure without noise, and when noise is no longer available as protection, clarity becomes uncomfortable for those who were never relying on understanding in the first place, but on how difficult they made things sound. Number 12, intelligence often refuses to participate in unnecessary drama, and drama-dependent people interpret absence as superiority. There is a specific type of social environment where attention is constantly moving through conflict, emotional reactions, and small bursts of tension. In those spaces, engagement is often measured by how much you react, how quickly you respond, and how emotionally involved you become in situations that may not actually require deep involvement. Drama becomes the background rhythm of interaction, even when nothing meaningful is being built from it. In that kind of setting, stepping away from unnecessary emotional noise is not always understood in a neutral way. When you choose not to respond to every provocation, not to enter every disagreement, and not to invest energy into situations that repeat the same patterns, your behavior stands out. Not because you are trying to be different, but because you are not feeding into what others consider normal interaction. And in environments like that, silence or emotional distance does not remain neutral for long. People begin to interpret your lack of participation through comparison. If they are used to constant engagement with tension and you are not, it creates a visible contrast. And instead of recognizing it as emotional discipline or selective attention, some people translate it as detachment or superiority. Because in their framework, being involved in everything is tied to being connected. So not being involved starts to look like you are above it, even when that is not the case. What they don't always see is that you are not rejecting people. You are rejecting unnecessary cycles. You are not withdrawing to position yourself higher. You are simply not investing energy into patterns that produce the same outcomes without growth. But drama-heavy environments often struggle with that distinction. If attention is the main currency of connection, then choosing where not to give attention feels like a statement of status rather than a choice of focus. So your absence from certain emotional cycles gets rewritten as arrogance, not because you acted superior, but because you didn't participate in the system that required constant reaction to feel alive. Number 13, many people were rewarded for fitting in, not for thinking clearly. Most social environments teach people from an early stage that acceptance comes from alignment. If you speak like everyone else, agree with what is commonly accepted, and avoid disrupting group comfort, you are often rewarded with approval. That approval can come in the form of inclusion, praise, or simply being seen as easy to get along with. Over time, this creates a pattern where fitting in becomes safer than thinking independently. So many people grow into systems where belonging is tied to agreement. This is important because it shapes how intelligence is perceived later in life. When someone is used to being rewarded for staying aligned with the group, encountering someone who thinks independently can feel unsettling. Not because the independent thinking is harmful, but because it doesn't follow the same reward system they were trained in. When you prioritize clarity over agreement, you stop matching that pattern. You don't adjust your thoughts just to stay inside what is socially comfortable. You don't dilute your perspective to maintain smooth approval. You simply think in a way that makes sense to you first, even if it doesn't immediately align with the group. And that difference becomes noticeable. To people who are shaped by approval-based systems, your independence can feel like rejection of their way of belonging. If agreement equals safety in their experience, then disagreement or separate thinking can feel like disruption. They may not consciously recognize this connection, but they still react to it emotionally. So instead of seeing your thinking as just another valid perspective, it can be interpreted through the lens of comparison. If they were rewarded for fitting in and you are not following that same path, it creates an internal tension. And to resolve that tension, the mind often shifts the interpretation away from themselves and toward you. That is where the misunderstanding forms. What is actually a difference in conditioning becomes framed as a difference in character. Your clarity is not necessarily seen as just thinking differently, but as thinking too highly or being disconnected from others. Not because that is accurate, but because it protects the structure they grew up with. In reality, you are not breaking belonging. You are simply not relying on the same system that defined belonging for them. But in environments built on conformity rewards, independent thinking often gets mislabeled because it no longer fits the rules people were quietly trained to follow. Number 14. When someone calls intelligence arrogance, they are often revealing the exact moment they stopped trying to grow. There is a point in every person's life where they either stay open to learning or quietly decide that they already understand enough. It doesn't always happen consciously. It can be gradual. A few experiences where curiosity felt unrewarded. A few moments where questioning things made them feel uncomfortable or out of place. Over time, the effort to keep expanding their understanding starts to feel less necessary than the effort to protect what they already believe. So growth slows down even if life continues. When someone like you continues to think deeply, question patterns, and refine understanding beyond what is commonly accepted, it naturally creates contrast. Not because you are trying to be above anyone, but because you are still actively engaging with learning while others may have shifted into preserving certainty. That contrast becomes noticeable in conversations. You might challenge assumptions that others have already settled into. You might see contradictions that they no longer examine closely. And instead of that difference being seen as just different stages of thinking, it can trigger discomfort because it quietly reminds people of a path they stopped walking. When that discomfort appears, it is easier for the mind to externalize it than to reflect inward. Admitting, "I haven't thought about this in a long time," requires vulnerability. Admitting, "I might not have updated my thinking here," requires openness. So instead, the situation gets reframed in a way that protects identity, and that is where the label forms. Calling someone arrogant becomes a way to avoid engaging with the gap in growth. It shifts attention away from self-reflection and places it onto the perceived attitude of the other person. It turns an internal moment into an external judgment. But what is actually happening is simpler. Your continued curiosity acts like a mirror. It doesn't force anyone to change, but it reflects where change has paused. And not everyone is ready to see that reflection clearly. So instead of saying, "I stopped exploring this area," it becomes easier to say, "You think you know more than everyone." In reality, it is not always about you thinking you are better. It is about your willingness to keep evolving, highlighting where others chose stability over exploration. And that reminder, more than anything, is what gets mistaken for arrogance, when it is really just ongoing growth meeting, paused curiosity. In the end, what we call arrogance is often not arrogance at all, but difference that people don't yet have language for. Intelligence doesn't always announce itself loudly. It shows up quietly in how someone thinks, how they question, how they refuse to accept things just because they are popular, and how they stop participating in patterns that were never built on truth in the first place. But human nature is sensitive to contrast. When someone thinks faster, deeper, or more independently, it doesn't automatically create admiration in every environment. Sometimes it creates discomfort first, because it forces people to become aware of things they were not actively questioning. It highlights gaps, exposes assumptions, and interrupts systems that were running smoothly on habit rather than awareness. And when discomfort has no honest explanation, it often gets turned into judgment. That is why the label arrogant gets used so easily. It is a shortcut. It is a way to avoid the harder work of self-reflection. It is easier to say someone is acting superior than to admit, I didn't see that, or I haven't thought about that, or even, I stopped challenging my own understanding a long time ago. But real intelligence does not exist to be socially comfortable. It exists to be accurate. Sometimes that accuracy will feel calm. Sometimes it will feel sharp. Sometimes it will feel too clear for people who are used to ambiguity. And in those moments, misunderstanding becomes almost inevitable. Still, clarity is not something that should be reduced just to make others feel safe. Growth has never been comfortable for everyone at the same time. What matters is staying honest with how you see things, even when others interpret it through their own limitations. Because over time, truth has a way of revealing itself. What was once called arrogance often becomes recognized later as insight. What was once dismissed as attitude becomes understood as awareness. And what was once misunderstood becomes eventually undeniable. So if this message speaks to you, stay grounded in your clarity. Don't shrink your thinking, just to avoid being misread by people who are not used to depth yet. If you found value in this, subscribe to the channel for more deep and thought-provoking content like this. Like the video, if it resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. It helps the message reach more people who are starting to see things differently too. Stay blessed, chosen ones.